Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Nash, AEPG, and I'm just really thrilled to be here today. We have an amazing program. It's going to be extremely illuminating and informational for everyone. And I would just like to let everyone know that this is a webinar that has two sponsors, Commit and Drill to Frac. And also we have our divisions that are supporting it, Division of Environmental Geosciences and also the Division of Professional Affairs. I'd like to let everybody know that we're joining APG is a great deal. And also we have an affiliated society, Tulsa Geological Society, that's also supporting this webinar. And it's just incredibly exciting. If you're interested in a face-to-face event, we will be meeting in February in Pittsburgh, where we will have a face-to-face meeting for 2 days. And it will be an orphan well and carbon credits type of thing. So today's topic is carbon credits and plugging wells, the standards, the economics, and how it works. And I'm thrilled to say that we have very distinguished presenters today. We have Staci Taruscio, Chief Executive Officer at Rebellion Energy Solutions. We have Corinne Boone, who's the Group Head of AirCarbon. And we also have Densmore, who's the Director of Industrial Solutions, American Carbon Registry. And all are definitely leaders in this area of plugging orphan wells and obtaining carbon credits, and also marketing carbon credits, assuring the quality and everything that has to do with carbon methodologies and credits. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Shall I go ahead and share my screen, Susan?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to pull it up, folks. Maybe someone give me a nod when you can see it. Susan, am I good?
It says it's starting, it's waiting, it's thinking.
Okay.
Here we go, we're there.
Okay, all right, good deal. So we kind of structured this such that Corinne and I are going to sort of share this deck at the beginning. Corinne and I have worked together quite a bit in the last several months as some of these projects have come to fruition. And then Maris, who we've also worked with quite a bit early on in this deal, she'll kind of follow our presentation. So I will invite Corinne and Maris to interrupt me at any time, and I will feel free to do the same, I suppose, for you guys if there's important things to say. I'm going to let Corinne kind of start off here, and Corinne, unless you have anything else, I'm going to let you take it and jump to this slide here to get us started.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much. So thanks very much, Susan, for the invitation, and Staci as well. And really, it's really a pleasure to be presenting with the two of you, Staci and Maris. I've not met Maris before, but I'm very glad to see this methodology come out. It's, one of the best things about this methodology is how simple it is to read it. I don't know if any of you have gone through a number of methodologies on the various registries, but this is it's refreshing. It's a very important methodology. Should have been here a long time ago. That's not a criticism, but it's also very simple to digest and understand. And especially, I think, for those of you that are in the business, you'll get it. And I think that's really important. So I'm just going to start off with the basics, sort of. What is, we hear about, carbon credits and offsets and carbon credit trading and allowance systems and emissions trading, all kinds of different names for different types of programs, compliance, voluntary, regional, state, national, UN. We hear all kinds of different types of terminologies when we talk about the carbon credit market. And I think one of the important things is to understand exactly what a carbon credit is, and then where it applies vis-a-vis the orphan wells methodology. So just starting off, just in very basic terms, a carbon credit in terms of its quantifiable term is equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, measured in terms of being able to use it against offsetting your carbon footprint. So if you're if you're an oil and gas producer and you're emitting CO2 emissions from your processes, 1 carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide emission. And in terms of a credit, it's equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide either removed, abated, reduced, avoided. There's all kinds of different types of terminology around that, but this is really just showing, this first slide is really just to show that most businesses can't abate all of their carbon dioxide emissions and still stay profitable in terms of these pure financial profitability. But there are, we do know that there is a need to address the environment and to focus in on trying to address the matter of climate change, even beyond what is planned and or being thought of in terms of compliance. And what we're going to be talking here today about is the voluntary carbon market. And there's a lot of companies and a lot of opportunities for project developers like many of you here on this call who can really look at ways in which to take this orphan wells methodology and adapt it to projects and utilize it to develop carbon credits, and then after going through a process which we'll talk about, be able to potentially transact them in the market and realize financial value from them. But simplest term, 1 carbon credit equals 1 metric ton of carbon or its equivalent. Carbon credits really need to be, I'm going to go back to my older school way of explaining this because it needs to be real. The first thing I would say, it needs to be measurable, i.e. it needs to be, quantifiable. It needs to be able to be validated by a third party, verified by a third party. It needs to be additional. It needs to be something that isn't business as usual. It needs to be something that's surplus to regulation, and it actually needs to be permanent. You need to be able to demonstrate that these emission reductions can actually, that are occurring, are going to last. Next slide, please. And why are we talking about the voluntary carbon market? This methodology, which has been developed by ACR, is applicable to the voluntary carbon market. In the world of carbon, there are compliance markets and there are voluntary carbon markets. So the of you that are in the US probably are familiar with the California regulation. So there's a compliance market for greenhouse gas emissions in California. There's a California-Quebec program. There's a regional greenhouse gas initiative in the United States. There's all kinds of countries that have some greenhouse gas emissions trading systems. There's the EU, and then there's the United Nations, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is looking at implementing a global compliance market. We're talking about a voluntary carbon market here. That is one in which firms are going beyond their regulated emissions requirements at this point in time, because they know that it's going to, if we need to get to net zero as a globe, as a world, more than just what's happening in the compliance market is really necessary in order to get us towards there. So those companies that are taking on a voluntary carbon market target are really your market if you're a project developer for this methodology at this point in time. And those are companies that are taking on obligations on a voluntary basis and going out to look for carbon credits from good projects such as those that can be generated from this methodology to help them to get towards net zero. And that's where the carbon credits come in. And the registries such as ACR in this case, and Verra, which is another registry, Gold Standard, which is another one, they are all voluntary carbon market registries which provide frameworks for certifying carbon credits and issuing them so that you actually have a real tangible certificate for each ton of your greenhouse gas emission reduction, offset avoidance, what have you, which is termed to be a carbon credit. Next slide, please. So really, how do you go about registering your carbon credits? If you're a project developer and you're looking at using this orphan wells methodology in order to establish a project and develop some carbon credits, first off, you're going to want, Staci will go into the details of some actual projects to go through this. But what you're going to do is you're going to find a project, you're going to implement a plugging process in accordance with this ACR methodology. You're going to develop your project documentation. You're going to submit it to the registry, in this case, ACR, under a methodology, in this case, this one. You're going to hire an external validator, a third-party validator. You're going to have the project method, the documentation validated. You're going to have it verified once you've gone through a certain period of operation, so that you can demonstrate that you've actually generated you've avoided methane as a result of plugging your well. You're going to have that verified by a third party, which is an official body that's recognized by the registries. You're going to take all of that documentation then, and the verification body is going to submit it to the registry. And you're going to apply for carbon credit issuance from ACR. And then once you have those carbon credits, you can actually enter into the market to look at opportunities to transact them and to put a value on them and to sell them to someone who has a voluntary commitment. Next slide, please. And that's sort of where AirCarbon Exchange comes in. We are a global exchange. We work with national governments, we work with sellers, we work with buyers, and we work with investors. And in the case of this type of methodology, for example, we provide access for sellers to over 180 potential mix of buyers and sellers in the market who are looking for opportunities to purchase, for the most part, carbon credits. We have typically, if you're going into what we call in the financial markets, an over-the-counter process, you're looking all around the market. You have a broker who's looking for different types of buyers, or maybe one buyer, two buyer, three buyers. It may take months to negotiate a contract. You have to enter into legal arrangements, all of which takes multiple months to negotiate, and you end up maybe 6, 7, 8 months later with a purchase and sale agreement that sometimes can actually get canceled at the very last minute due to changes in the direction of companies and what have you. What happens with AirCarbon Exchange is that we have a full list of buyers, we have a full list of sellers. We've already fully developed all of the standardized contracts, the tools. We provide settlement, we provide clearing, we provide auctions, we provide access to the market, and it's almost instantaneous if your carbon credits are issued and you know what it is that you want in terms of price, unless you want to run what we call an auction. And it's very fast, it's cost effective, and it's all digitally tracked. So you always have a historical record of each and every ton of carbon credit that you've either sold or purchased. Next slide, please. So carbon credits values, they can range at this point in the market. There are some uncertainties. I know most of you will probably have done a little bit of research on the voluntary carbon market, and there has been some uncertainties of late, specifically with regards to some of the nature-based solutions within the voluntary carbon market and what we call RED Plus, and mostly around uncertainties in terms of baseline and performance and carbon dioxide equivalents removed. This methodology, though, is a type of methodology that's easily quantifiable. There's not very much opportunity at all for leakage. There is a great opportunity for permanence, and it is something that can be, in my view, easily transacted. The quality of a carbon credit, the value of a carbon credit will be dictated by whether or not it's registered or unregistered. In my view, you can't really effectively sell a carbon credit that's not registered now. You can't actually sell a carbon credit that's not actually certified and issued by a very well-known established bodies such as ACR, and it really will depend on the type of carbon credit you have. The certainty about the immediate emission reductions and the ongoing emission reductions will also affect values. And the other thing that will affect your carbon credit value will be whether or not you can demonstrate that your project addresses one of the 17 or more than one of the 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which focus on poverty, focus on hunger, access to education, access to water, local benefits, climate change, etc. So all of these factors together, as well as the type of counterparties that you have and the types of projects that you have ongoing, will really affect carbon credit values within the voluntary carbon market. At the current time, the carbon credit market sits at around $2 billion, and maybe you could go to the next slide. I think I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself.
Well, can I pause you right there, Corinne, because there's an open question that says, do we have a hard understanding of the value anticipated for these P&A credits yet? So if you want to take a stab at that when you're kind of talking about value, maybe that would be appreciated.
Sure. Well, to be honest, because of all of the uncertainties in the carbon credit market at the current, the voluntary carbon market specifically, and then the ongoing negotiations at the UN level of any of those of you that are following the compliance market, is that there is a a growing thought that the voluntary carbon markets and the compliance markets will integrate to some extent because of the types of carbon credits, the need to reduce uncertainty in the carbon credit market for both buyers and sellers, and the applicability of different types of projects at the national, the local and the regional levels. But if I had to guess today, and please don't quote me on this, because the price, that's the beauty of having exchange as well, because you can see the market prices daily when these types of credits do start to transact, is that I would, if I were a betting person right now, I would say that these types of credits, because of their quality, the ease of measurability, and the permanence of them as well, will all lead to somewhere around the $8 to $10 mark per ton. I don't know, Staci, you've given some thought to this as well recently. What would you say?
Yeah, I think the answer to the question is no, we don't have a great understanding of what that price point is going to be yet. And we don't have that because no one, to my knowledge, has sold an ACR registered credit under this methodology to date. So I know there's a couple sort of peripheral comps that we could look at. You could analyze the market in ad nauseum and decide what you think that these are comparable to and go that way. But I know that there have been unregistered credits sold that are either similar to this methodology or kind of in that well plugging space. And I've heard that those have gone, for kind of in that same range that Corinne mentioned. And, we hear often that depending upon how wholesome your project is, and when I say that, I'm thinking of things like some of those UN SDGs being quantified, and some of the kind of co-benefits you can add in. I think maybe there's a premium to be had there. Really, I think if there's one thing I would love to have come across when I do kind of conversations like this, it is that quality is really, really important, and integrity in these credits is really, really important, not just for a project developer or a single project, but for the viability of the entire voluntary carbon market, right? I think there could be a tendency to want to try and go for quantity and not quality here. And I really think that's a mistake. I think it will degrade the value of not just these credits, not just all of the businesses sort of forming around it in that ecosystem, but also the market if we have bad actors come in and try to get away with stuff. So that's my encouragement along the way is I think that price point will come, and I think it will continue to increase if, for the most part, we're all producing credits that are of a very, very high quality and are incredibly durable. So that's my message. I'll go back to Corinne, and honestly, that's all I needed to say today.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's very, really that sort of wraps it all up with a nice bow. It is actually quality and integrity are the two most important aspects of being able to participate in the carbon market, and to actually be able to transact effectively and for the long term in this market as well. And that's really why the market, to some extent, in every market, there's bad actors and there's good actors. And if you want this methodology and these types of products to be successful, my advice is to make sure that each and every product that you undertake is to the utmost of quality, and question everything and make sure that every detail is addressed. Having said that, the market itself, in terms of the voluntary carbon market space, I'm not talking about the compliance market space, which is, the compliance market space right now is a lot larger than the voluntary carbon market. But the voluntary carbon market itself in 2022, 2023 sort of have averaged around $2 billion. And we anticipate that will increase by a factor of about 10 by 2030, and then by a factor of 40 by 2050. There are a couple of initiatives that are ongoing right now, which are focused on developing better guidelines for creating carbon credits, and then also for how you claim for use of carbon credits. And those initiatives, along with increased attention from regulators, are really factors that will drive quality and integrity and longevity of this market. And as those initiatives and as registries such as ACR and Vera and Gold Standard and others, continuously evolve over time, that will lead to a significant growth in the voluntary carbon market. May or may not be some integration with the compliance market, probably maybe, but I think we'll still see a lot of this activity take place. And this methodology, again, just to say, it's addressing a huge issue that really needs to be addressed, and I think it's one that will be around for the long term. I noticed somebody had a question in the chat about this methodology being applicable to only the USA and Canada, and perhaps we'll let Maris answer that when she talks about ACR's perspective in the development of the methodology. But it is only applicable to USA and Canada right now. So today's situation, there's all kinds of, governments have taken on commitments under the Paris Agreement, continuing on from the Kyoto Protocol, pledging to reach net zero. Companies worldwide have taken on, pledges again as well to get to net zero, and a lot of that will come through voluntary activity. ESG, there's been a lot of challenges in that space to really make sure that companies and countries even really demonstrate that they are actually doing what they're saying that they're doing in terms of claims and integrity, and especially as it relates to the use of carbon credits. And I think that will really, facilitate also improvements in the market. But, achieving net zero, even if we take all of the, the compliance regimes, if you look at the United Nations and all the different carbon credit regimes that are under compliance from our market, that's not actually going to get us to our net zero. We really need the voluntary carbon market and the types of credits that can be generated from projects such as this to help us realize our net zero targets and get there. And, without the voluntary carbon market, we are not going to achieve this, and without other types of voluntary activities. So, but today, and right now, the voluntary carbon markets are opaque, they're inefficient, and they're fragmented, and transaction costs are usually quite high. We need to get some understanding and transparency in the market around, areas. The big question at the beginning here was about prices. What will be the price, and how much will transact? And to date, in most of the carbon markets, that pricing information is quite opaque, which is one of the reasons why AirCarbon Exchange developed. The transaction processes are inefficient, and oftentimes project developers are, seeing 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35% of their profits go out the door on an ongoing basis for quantification, sometimes even more, and certification and issuance, and then marketing rights to brokers and project transaction entities, and this really leads to a downturn in the ability of project developers such as yourself to take those monies that you receive and products that you do and put them back into additional projects that will help us to get more carbon credits, and really to address getting us more towards net zero. And that's really the reason why AirCarbon actually why we developed this company, was to try to bring trust, transparency, efficiency, and standardization to this market. Next slide, please.
So I think this is where I take over, but I'm going to pause and try to answer a couple of the questions here. One of the questions in the chat is, how auditable are these credits? And can you compare them to like a reserve report or an SEC reserve report? And I would say that it is comparable to that, but in my opinion, a lot simpler, because what we're dealing with is a pretty, when you take a baseline emission, it's that, and it's that for 20 years. And so, although that may shift and change as this methodology, continues to develop itself, I would say that it's much simpler than a reserve report. Now, the audit process, we're actually just going through this validation and verification process now with our first project. And that process has looked a lot like having a reserve auditor, lots of back and forth questions and digging into the details of your data and things like that. So comparable in process, but dealing with a simpler set of techniques as far as establishing that baseline. So the next question I want to address is from Scott. Does anyone have a handle on how much of the US emissions the P&A market truly represents? And I think the answer to that simply is no, because what we also don't have a handle on is how many orphaned and abandoned wells there are out there. So I'm going to speak just to orphan wells because that's what this methodology applies to in its current state. We know that there's several sources out there that that have about 120,000 orphan wells in the US today. So I'm just talking US now. We think, and the National Energy Technology Lab would corroborate this, that for every one orphan well that's documented, there are about 8 more that go undocumented. So you're looking at close to 1 million orphan wells in the US right now. Again, that doesn't include abandoned wells that may become orphan in the future. So none of the pipeline is being addressed there. You know, and I think you could look at research that's been put out to understand how many of those might be emitting. I'll tell you from my experience, and of course it's kind of basin and field specific, but my experience that I would extrapolate out to the entire US is that about 8% of those wells are leaking in quantities that would make them appropriate candidates for a methodology like this. So are leaking in carbon credit economic positive ways. And so when I think about that, I think about, you know, let's say each well is worth, each of those 8% wells is worth 10,000 metric tons, and it begins to add up really quickly. So the answer is no, we don't know, but that's my guess. And I think the problem is not so much that any one well or even a lot of wells is leaking a lot. It's that there are so many wells, so many candidates for this methodology that are leaking a little bit. And so it's really about kind of amalgamating all of those into projects. And then let's see if I can get one more question. I'll let Maris ask about scaling this to different parts of the world. I don't understand the question. Is there any model for carbon credits? So you might give me more words on that one. And then Corinne, a question for you. What scope emissions are you focused on for your registry? Do you have a focus, or are you just looking to kind of meet buyers' needs, and that's really up to them?
So the AirCarbon Exchange is focusing on transacting tons of carbon dioxide emissions that tons of carbon credits that can be used by firms to address their scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions, depending on how they want to use them. Some firms, for example, have decided to take very specific approaches about what they'll use for their scope 3 in terms of the life cycle of their emissions. They're looking at insets instead of, what we term insets instead of offsets, and different types of, so it really depends on what the client is looking for. We're not actually a registry, we're an exchange. So we're really providing the financial vehicle through which to transact carbon credits to onboarded clients that so the buyers and sellers can meet in the market and transact carbon tonnage.
Yeah, I would say when I look at net zero goals from most of the sort of public companies, they're really just addressing scope 1 and 2 at this point. So maybe that's a semi answer to your question. And then the last question is Brendan is asking about the economics of the project. And if you'll give me a minute, I'll try to get to that. Okay. And a little bit later in this.
But maybe Staci, I could just mention, there is some potential regulation coming out in the US by the Securities and Exchange Commission that could in fact change the way in which corporations have to manage, report, and disclose on their scope 1, 2, and potentially 3 emissions. So although most firms are addressing scope 1 and 2 now, there is a movement to try to move beyond that. Take a lot more time, I think, but there is somewhat of a desire on the part of some to do that.
Yeah. And Jeff, I'll answer your question as well around measurement. And if I don't, please remind me, but I'm going to try and start going through these slides so we can make sure Maris has time. And some of these are rather simple. So again, happy to answer questions at the end, but as far as applying that whole conversation about carbon credits and carbon markets down to orphan wells. I think the methodology is available at the American Carbon Registry. You can read through it. It reads a bit, sorry, Maris, but it's a little bit of a tough read. It reads like a legal document to me. I have to read those same words like 6 different times before it gets in there. So you might have to have a little patience with it because it is pretty technical, but read it and see what you think. Kind of the basic steps here. The 101 is that you first have to identify wells that are eligible for the methodology. The big one there is orphan wells and not just any old abandoned well. So it has to be orphan and meet that definition, which Maris just put in the chat. The next thing is to establish a baseline emission. So this includes going out to the well site and measuring what methane may be leaking from the well. And establishing the baseline is not just taking a measurement. And this speaks to quality again, it's taking a measurement that is credible for the full crediting period. And so you have to see consistent leakage that gives you high degree of certainty that you're accurately measuring this well. In the case of this methodology, you go out and take a first measurement, wait 30 days, take a second measurement, then you plug the well. And this is to be done at a different state and tribal, in some cases, regulations. But another point to make here is, there's a good way to plug wells, and then there's some less good ways to plug wells. And I think when those regulations were created, they were about plugging wells in the near term. And I think when we're talking about plugging wells now, we're talking about permanence. And so, think about this, make sure we're doing it as an industry in a way that holds true and is truly a permanent plug. After you plug the well, you come back and you measure the well again and confirm that there are 0 emissions and that you've successfully completed this adventure. And then, like was mentioned earlier, you can submit all your paperwork to the registry for sort of processing. And so someone asked about the kind of math behind this. And so I'm going to go through just an example of the math. And I'll talk about it a little bit more afterwards. An MCF a day is for the most part is methane, depending upon, again, the content and all of that. But 1,000 cubic feet of CH4 a day is roughly 19,000 grams of CH4 a day. That translates to 7 metric tons of CH4 per year. All that is pretty simple. There's some PV equals nRT in there, but we can help you out if you need us to on that part. 7 metric tons of CH4 per year translates using that. It's a 28 to 30 global warming potential. I think Maris put the detailed version of that answer in the chat as well. But roughly 200 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year, 1 metric ton being equal to 1 carbon credit, as we talked about very early on. And so for a 20-year crediting period, that's roughly 4,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So for a 1 MCF a day well, depending upon what you think the value per metric ton to be, let's just call it, I think maybe Corinne said $8 to $12. So let's call it a $10 because that math's easy. 4,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year at $10 a metric ton is $40,000 per well. And so one of the questions in the chat was, is that substantial enough to overcome the burden of plugging costs? And so I'm going to reference, there's a guy named Daniel Ramey. He works at Resources for the Future. And I think that he would like to take this analysis to a deeper level, but just on his initial, he looked at 19,000 wells and kind of in his paper published what it costs to plug a well. I think there are probably lots of oil and gas folks on this call, so you guys know what it costs to plug a well. But for talking purposes, there are a lot of wells out there. Of those million orphan wells out there, a lot of them can be plugged for $40,000 or less. So the average cost to plug a well, according to Daniel Ramey, was roughly $20,000. So if you get $10 a metric ton, then you've basically doubled your cost to plug the well. Now, of course, there's some other costs that go along to making this a business, but really the big cost driver on a lot of this is how are you restoring that surface? And luckily, that's tied to the value of these credits, right? I think people will likely pay more for those wholesome projects that don't just plug the wells, but address the environment and social concerns that have been impacted along the way. So the answer is yes, at least in my opinion, that this makes economic sense and is a viable business model. And the proof is in the pudding for me, because that is what my business does. So hopefully I will be right. I'm not going to pay attention to the questions as much since I'm the one talking now, but I do want to go through a sort of a pilot project that we've done. To my knowledge, it's one of the first ones out there, although I know there have been a lot of people measuring wells and kind of leading up to this, but just this 6-well kind of proof of concept project that we did in Oklahoma. And you can read, I won't read those words to you, but that is the project that I was telling you earlier is sort of currently going through this validation and verification phase. And is on the registry at ACR. So one of the other questions was, how long does that process take? And I think the answer is, I don't know yet. But when we get our validation letter, it will then be back in ACR's court, and they'll be able to go through their sort of administration process. Hopefully that won't be very long, but we'll see. It's also new to them. So patience will be valuable in that realm as well. This example project was 6 wells and generated, it's actually going to be a little more than metric tons. It's actually going to be 86,000 metric tons after we go through this process. And that's roughly equivalent to taking 15,000 passenger vehicles off the road. So from a do-good perspective, I think it feels really good. From a technical perspective, that means we plugged 6 wells, and they were shallow gas wells. So they cost us roughly $10,000 a well to plug. $60,000 plus, you know, there's cost in there associated with kind of what we call project development, which is you have to measure 10 wells to find one kind of a thing. And as well as like G&A and all of that additional stuff you have to pay for. But this project, even though it's the pilot, and even though we don't have everything quite perfected and perfectly efficient yet, will still make money at that $10 per metric ton mark. So this is a viable business model, again, assuming that that these credits, it's not really what's the price, is it in line with what the market is thinking right now. So let's see, I'll stop for a second. I think I'm answering how, so I'm going to address, Brendan, you asked about the viability of these projects, and I think I generally answered that question, but of course it all depends on finding wells that have leaks that are substantial enough to create those economics, right? And so what we see out there in the research, I think there's several papers, you know, EDF has some work out there. Amy Townsend Small at University of Cincinnati has some work out there that's very good. Mary Kang has some work out there that's very good. And all of those scientists have kind of taken measurements over the course of years, and they're coming out with numbers that feel very small when we start talking about leak size and economic viability. And the distinction that I want to make there is, when you're a research scientist and you're going out and measuring wells, you are measuring wells that you have access to. And they haven't yet measured enough wells to be anywhere close to sort of statistically significant or representative of the entire United States. So, so more work could always be done there, but they're taking measurements on wells they have access to. And for those of us that are in the oil and gas industry, wells that you have access to isn't necessarily correlative to wells that should leak, right? So you may go out and measure an oil well that's never produced a lick of gas just because you have access to it, and you're not going to get very high measurements from that. So we are seeing pretty substantially different results than what we see in the research. And a lot of that is because we are targeting concentrations of wells that have a higher propensity for leak than the wells that I think were available to those researchers. And so we look for things like what's been the historic GOR. That's an easy one. There are a lot of other things you could look at when you have sort of the standard subscription to oil and gas data. You can cull through those. And I don't think that we can predict where a leak will be, but I do think we're very good at calling out where we know leaks won't be. And that's a big part of the issue there. So I hope that gives you a little more color on that question as well. Let's see. Let me stop. Oh, man, what time is it? We have 5 minutes. I'm going to let Corinne get through this so she doesn't get cut off and Maris has time, and then we can do more questions later.
Okay, very, very quickly, I'm just going to address one of the questions here in the chat room as it relates to AirCarbon Exchange. So AirCarbon Exchange does use blockchain to establish an irrefutable historical record of each and every ton of carbon that transacts on our exchange, and it's linked it's linked to the registries, but it's not the way in which we transact with ACR, for example. But we use blockchain in order to develop an irrefutable historical ledger of when a ton is created and how it's transacted and where it goes. So we do use blockchain, and it is very valuable from that perspective as well. So just going on to the next, I hope that answered that question. So AirCarbon Exchange sort of in action, I just thought I'd give a couple of examples. If you're a project developer and you are implementing a project like Staci just went over, the pilot project that she went over. So let's say you're interested in this kind of a project. So you find a project, much like Staci and her firm does. If you're in this business, you use the ACR methodology. Once you establish whether or not it's a viable type of project, you use the methodology, you follow it, you go forward and you do all of the work that you need to establish your baseline, to plug your well, to do your monitoring, to go back, to provide your documentation, to get your validation, your certification, and then have it certified and receive your carbon credit issuance, much like Staci is in the process of doing for her project. And then you can choose to talk to AirCarbon Exchange, and you can say, okay, I'm a project developer. I want to figure out what's the best way to sell my carbon credits. If you're developing a project and you don't think you're going to have a significant amount of tons over a long period of time, in terms of this is not the business that you're in forever, you might choose to go to what we call the Carbon Market Board, where you onboard with AirCarbon, you list your carbon credits that are validated and issued by American Carbon Registry. You list them on our Carbon Market Board. Your project is identified. Buyers that are in the market have access to see that information. But before it even gets through the transaction, we actually validate that these carbon credits have gone through all the hoops that they need to and have been issued by ACR. And then we also get the British Standards Institute to do a verification to make sure that everything is as it's to be. So that's another level of integrity in terms of the carbon credits associated with your projects. Then you transfer your carbon credits that you've received. We have accounts with ACR. You can transfer them through to a trust account. AirCarbon undertakes a transaction. They can clear the transaction for you, and then you are provided with we can retire the credits in the name of the buyer, and the buyer pays the money, the seller transfers the credits, and then the fees are all very transparent on the site. And if you're a buyer, you get your money according to the terms and conditions of the Master Emissions Reduction Purchase Agreement that you sign. If you're the seller, you get your carbon credits, and they're listed on ACR, and they can be retired in your name. And if you might actually say, okay, well, I want to do something very innovative. I think I have a great project that's gone above and beyond, like Staci mentioned. Maybe you've gone above and beyond, and you've really identified some benefits associated with this project that are not common to other projects. So I might want to do an auction. You might work with AirCarbon to establish an auction where you can put them out to the entire market. You can set a floor price. You can say, I want want these types of buyers to be given consideration, and we run an auction for an hour, a day, however long you wish. We do some marketing beforehand to generate interest, and then we do the same thing to facilitate the transaction to transfer the carbon credits which are always on registries. They're never held in AirCarbon ownership, and then we retire in the name of the buyer as well, should they wish to retire those carbon credits. And that's sort of how we do transactions. If you're a buyer and if you're a seller, just the opposite. So just maybe we can skip the next slide in the interest of time, Staci.
Okay.
And then just fast facts, we have a lot of partners. We have one for the last 3 years. It's our marketing spiel that I'm required to do. We have one for the last 3 years, the world's best voluntary carbon market exchange. And so we hope to have an opportunity to work with some of you. And we are really enjoying this work that we're doing with Rebellion and Staci. And again, I can't say enough about the ACR methodology. Next slide. And I think, we can just skip this slide in the interest of time.
Okay. And I think generally that's all I have. I hope you've taken some of the main points that we intended out of this, although maybe we ran out of time. And of course, Corinne and I's contact information is here. And Susan, maybe I'll throw in the chat my email address and website. So if people want to reach out after this, they are very welcome to do so. And I will do my best to answer your question. And Maris, I will let you take it from here.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And thanks for all the questions. I tried to stay up on them early on, but then I decided to try and also pay attention just in the interest of not repeating any of the fantastic information that was being shared by my co-presenter. So I am the caboose. I am Maris Densmore. I'm the Director of Industrial Solutions at ACR, and thank you guys for all the nice things you said about the registry and the methodology. It was definitely a labor of love. It evolved a lot throughout the development process, a lot of input from a lot of people. So I'll try not to repeat anything that's already been said. A lot of good information. I totally can't see the questions. So if there's an applicable question, someone just shout out, Staci or Corinne. So quick talk about ACR carbon markets and then digging into the methodology. ACR itself has been around for quite some time, but up until the last few years, we were kind of under the radar, and that explosion out into the limelight has been really, really great in terms of generating interest and sales, but also some intense and increased scrutiny. So our job within the carbon markets is really, it's deep, but it's somewhat narrow, just to keep an arm's length and keep the quality, be able to do the quality assurance for these credits. So we develop the methodology. We sometimes do it with partners. We do it in-house. And we work with project developers and verifiers to make sure that the credits that are generated under those methodologies are appropriate. We also support some of the compliance programs around the United States for developing credits within those compliance programs. So active in both the voluntary and compliance markets. And we have this methodology, and all of our voluntary methodologies are also eligible under the CORSIA International Aviation Compliance Program. So you can actually potentially generate compliance market credits with this methodology a little bit down the road as that program gets underway. So we have credits like this one that are more on the industrial engineered side, and then we have credits that are within the forestry and nature-based solutions. We are under the umbrella of Winrock International, so a development organization. So we're not looking at climate change in a vacuum. We're looking at it, how does this impact anything else, sustainable development goals maybe, but really the projects like Staci's, where she can talk about the site restoration that's going on. Those are the projects we really get excited about, because you're not just, certainly our metric is that 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, but all of the co-benefits are really important, and particularly being able to quantify those and point to those on the industrial side. So we have issued about $250 million credits from almost 500 projects. A lot of those are forestry. That's where we got our start, but increasingly looking at engineered solutions, agriculture, livestock, and these short-lived climate pollutants. There's, of course, every industry has their own alphabet soup. SLCPs are these short-lived climate pollutants, which would include methane, that have these high global warming potentials. And there were some questions about that earlier, and I answered in the chat. So we use the number 30 for methane as a multiplier for CO2 equivalent because it's a fossil methane and it's not being sort of recirculated through the atmosphere. But these gases, particularly methane, because it's contributed about a fifth to a quarter of the global warming to date in the atmosphere, is really important to get to the methane abatement as soon as possible. And that also would apply to some of the refrigerant gases. You can see the pictures like HFCs or CFCs that we also work on. This is the methodology development process. It is very action-packed. So we either decide to put together a methodology or we convene a third party to do it. That methodology development, write it, do all the calculations, look at it against our governing documents and our standard. The first public step really is putting it out there, the first draft, and so we can get public comments. We got hundreds of comments on this methodology from folks spanning the carbon markets to the oil and gas industry. A lot of really helpful things came out of that process that helped us shape the methodology. We respond to those comments. And then we get another review, which is the scientific peer review, which is usually folks within environmental NGOs or academia that take a look at the methodology. And we actually seek consensus with the experts on that. And that process, again, with this took a lot of back and forth and was very iterative and brought the methodology to the place that it is at right now. And then we publish it, we make public what the comments are from both the public and the scientific peer reviewers. You can sort of see the evolution, what questions were out there, what our responses were. And so this process to develop a new methodology usually takes anywhere from 18 months to much longer, depending on it. And talked about these early in the process, so I won't get into those. And just sort of hot topics around the carbon markets is that the demands on the markets are pretty intense right now. And that is, we need to increase in volume, we need to increase in types of credits that are generated, and we just have a lot more people entering the market. And with all of that, we also are seeing increased demand for transparency, accountability. People are really looking over our shoulders. We're getting a lot of media attention. So there's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts in the carbon markets right now. So we are really paying attention to these credits that we can point to as high quality, as high durability, where we can trace who the credit owners are, where we can really confirm that there's no double counting. And that's why we're really excited for this methodology. Some of the folks that are peering over our shoulders, besides just project developers, buyers, and the media, there are governance bodies like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, the ICBCM, and then ratings agencies. And they're looking at programs, methodologies, individual projects, and credits. And really, that is all these things together, including the conversations about reductions versus removals. This is a reductions methodology, and these short-lived climate pollutants. That stew that is in the carbon markets, really what you're going to see a year from now, 2 years from now, it's going to look a little different, but it's going to look better than what we have. So we've got some growing pains going right now for the carbon markets. This methodology published about 5 or 4 months ago, and really the key driver, as I said, for the carbon markets and for this methodology is what are the atmospheric benefits. We love all the stuff that we can attach to it, all the sustainability goals from the UN, but without being able to really assure that 1 ton of atmospheric benefit, we don't really have anything. So this really helps in the prioritization of plugging of wells with the most impact. Staci mentioned that 8% number. I'm hearing 5 to 10% from different states, provinces, and basins. So what I'm hearing aligns with that. And there are other funds out there, whether they're state funds or provincial funds, or federal dollars to do some of this plugging, but none of those really prioritize methane or really measure and quantify the methane that is being prevented from entering the atmosphere. So with this methodology, it encourages the identification and addressing of those wells. And some of the co-benefits I just listed here, certainly the SDGs through the UN, but there's local environmental benefits that we can talk about. There's workforce transition benefits that we can talk about. So there's lots of good things that come along with plugging all of these wells and creating really an industry for businesses like Rebellion to really lean in or step in to dedicating themselves to plugging and not sort of having to go back and forth between putting more holes in the ground to plugging holes. We talked a little bit about the basics. One thing I will flag on this is we really require a stable emission rate. And without that stable emission rate, we're not able to extrapolate over the length of the crediting period, which is 20 years. So we take the measurement, wait 30 days, take another measurement, plug the well, go back and make sure that it is not leaking. And here's a little bit to talk about that. That's stabilization. So obviously when you first go up to a well, who knows what you're going to find when you're out in the field. We've seen all the horror stories that I'm sure folks on the call can imagine. But once you hook up, maybe you have a period of sort of mixed emission rates, and then it stabilizes. And even that middle one, when you take a look at it overall, it's a very cyclical pattern. But as long as there's no decline on the slope of that line, you would be able to consider that. So stable over time. And how we address those tenants that we've talked a little bit about, and that I sort of skipped through the slide earlier, is that methane is permanently trapped in the subsurface. We do call for a demonstration from the project developers to address additionality, to demonstrate that the orphan wells are not required to be plugged. And that's why we went with orphaned wells and not wells that have owners. We do require some pretty intense paperwork to show that whoever is doing the plugging has the legal right to do so, and that whoever is claiming the credits has the legal right to do so, and that nobody else can make that claim. And then the usual verification and validation that goes on through this process. And we're really in the early days of working through that with the verification bodies. They know the methodology really well, and we really have to fit each well and each scenario into this methodology. And it's been a bit of an adventure. We have gotten a lot of credits, our crediting period questions about why 20 years. And this was pulled, give a shout out to Brooke, who is also helping out. Thank you, Brooke, with answering questions. There's a lot of orphan wells out there, and we imagine that there will be more orphan wells out there as time goes on. There's a lot of abandoned wells, and even just the wells that were reported by the various states as part of the federal program, we saw a big increase from one reporting to the next. And I love the estimate that Staci has that puts some numbers around it of maybe 8 orphan wells for every 1 documented orphan well. And that's really powerful information. I know, Staci, you've been out in the field and just found some wells that you did not know were there. So this graph represents plugging the time from a well's last date of production to the date that it was plugged. And you can see that there's this big orange bar, and that represents wells that remain unplugged. So the blue wells are wells that are actually being plugged, and it's taking a long time. The average number of years that a well is idle is 12, but then again, there's this huge number at the end of that.
Maris, I don't see your slides. Is it just me?
They're really good slides.
I can only imagine. Susan, can you see her slides?
No, I don't.
Oh no, how long has it been?
The whole time. I've never seen a slide.
Really?
Yeah,
Well,
but you were saying it so well that I didn't think we needed it until
That's
you
same
just,
here. In fact, I thought you'd chosen not to.
Okay, that's fine. There's this graph, and
It's
I can
great.
do an interpretive dance of the graph. Basically, the graph shows the data for well plugging, and it, if I'm not sharing, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And this does include, well, here, let me try and share again to see if I can folks see it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, I have it, and I was going to share mine if yours
It's
isn't.
slide 14. It's the first time I'm being told. Okay, so here's the graph. So this big orange bar here demonstrates that there's a lot of unplugged wells out there. There's quite an inventory. Okay, so The slides will be available if anyone wants them. I did send them over to Susan.
I'll send them out with the
Perfect.
email to the link.
Great, I appreciate it. So this is the ownership slide just to really demonstrate who owns what, make sure that there's not two different parties that can claim it. And some states are interested in being the owners, some states have no interest in it. So it's really however the business case works out for folks and how it works in the different jurisdictions. And then talking a little bit about the co-benefits. So specifically for this methodology, we have 3 direct positive co-benefits of sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, and then climate action, the SDGs. And then some indirect positives, good health, industry, innovation, infrastructure, life on land. And then there's some conditional ones where if you're within a certain distance to a national park or other federal lands, you can potentially get some additional sustainable development goals to check the box on for your different credits. And we do see buyers, and Corinne weigh in on this too, we do see buyers who go, I want a credit that addresses goals 3, 9, and 15. And then we're able to search for those and bring those and match the buyers appropriately. So I think I tried to blast through those. Thanks everybody for attention. Sorry that slides weren't working, but you can take a look at them if you're interested when they go on out in the final. So that's from me.
Well, I think that we can stay on as long as anybody wants to because I've never seen so much activity in the Q&A and also in the chat. And so I think that it's fine with me if we go a little bit longer.
I can stay on as long as people want to talk to me.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, no. Sure, that's fine. Okay.
Well, I think there's one question that I think that is probably on a lot of people's minds. It's in the chat, but it was talking about, let's see, Bill Fairhurst asked about sort of the permanence and what type of documents do you give the mineral owners or because I mean, ostensibly they have some skin in the game.
Yeah, the mineral owners probably depending on because yeah, you have mineral owners, you have surface owners, you have potential leaseholders, and so that's where the documentation comes in, that we have to make sure that we know who the credit owners are. And really these wells are for the most part going to be wells that are somewhat depleted, and they're not going to go back and plug or drill another well right next to them. So you would need buy-in from the mineral owners to ensure that they're okay with this well being plugged.
I mean, for the orphan wells, right? Because the orphan wells, I mean, they don't have an operator that's viable, but there are people who own the minerals.
Correct.
And so I would think that this is for example, if it's an 8th lease, well, I mean, maybe you could find the original lease, maybe not, but you think that they would get at least a percentage of you lease their, I mean, can you lease them for the carbon credit?
I mean, so it depends on a lot of different things, but one thing that happens when you plug a well just in a regular scenario is you may have to offer that well to other working interest owners. And so, other working interest owners may decide to participate in the plugging of the well and be entitled to their proportionate share of sort of go forward proceeds. And that's one way that a mineral owner or an interest owner could kind of share in profits. Or they may decide to take the well over, right? If that's an opportunity presented to them when they get noticed of that activity. And of course, there are all kinds of different regulations in different states. In a lot of states, the regulation doesn't override the private agreement of like a JOA, for example. And so, you really are having to do quite a substantial bit of title work to understand all of that ownership and make sure that you're doing the correct notifications and things like that along the way. So I didn't provide any clarity there. I probably made it more complex, but it just is complex. And the good news is oil and gas folks have expertise in that complexity and understand sort of the land aspects there very well.
And the other thing, maybe just adding to that, so both Maris and Staci have mentioned that you need to demonstrate clear title and ownership and rights to these. And when you get to the transaction in the legal contract as well, it comes up again. So at every stage in the process, you need to be able to, you know, demonstrate that you have clear title and the rights to sell these carbon credits as well. So just in that system level.
And maybe even before that, you also have to work with landowners because you have to have access to a lot of these wells. You can't just trespass. You can't just go on someone's land to take these measurements. And so there's a full, you know, surface use agreement and access agreement that you have to make sure you have in place so that you're staying compliant for the full, you know, the full life of the project.
But if we're plugging the orphan well and we're looking at permanence, how permanent is it? Is it the entire formation? Or is it just that well?
So I can dig on that a little bit.
Yeah, is it the leasehold and that formation, or in the way it's spaced, or is it? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, to all those things. And I remember a call actually Staci and I had probably 2 years ago where we just sort of talked reservoirs and drainage areas and 10-acre spacing, you know, for a while on just how to really be concerned about how much the methane would really be migrating. And the reality is the methane isn't going to migrate that far unless it's being driven. And in these depleted reservoirs, you know, you're really not going to see it by plugging one well, all the methane then shooting to another well and coming out of that well if there happens to be something that's hydraulically connected. So what we're looking at in terms of sort of assurance and paperwork is that, yes, since they're orphaned, that we, you know, have buy-in from all the folks that Staci mentioned, surface, you know, owners, and then the lease owners, the leaseholders, if there's mineral rights holders, anybody like that. And then also just as a sort of backstop, the local jurisdiction to make sure that we're able to do it. But from just a sort of geophysical perspective, I'm not worried about methane being driven willy-nilly about in the reservoirs.
I think that the current concern I would have if I were a mineral owner, royalty owner, I would say, okay, I'm on that lease, or I'm in that same quarter section forever, for example. And so that has gotten plugged and they've gotten carbon credits that says it's permanent. And so does this mean I can never later drill into that, lease it to drill into that formation, in that same formation? And gas, you know, usually is 640s. And so that's a pretty, at least in Oklahoma, you can often space gas on 640s, which is a square mile. So permanence, I would be afraid that that's just condemned by 640 in that formation. Is that correct? Or am I being apocalyptic and alarmist?
I'm very sorry. I'm just typing into the chat, so I probably didn't hear the whole question. But so if someone else has the answer, please feel free. Otherwise, I'm gonna have to ask you to repeat it. I'm very sorry.
Okay, I'll do it. Okay, so let's say that I have there's an orphan well in the same place where I have ownership. I've undivided interest under 640 acres, and that 640 is like a unit for a gas well.
Okay.
And so once that well has been plugged in that formation, to get the carbon credits, there has to be permanence. And so does that mean that suddenly I can no longer lease my acreage to get it drilled in that same formation because it's within 640 and it's a gas prospect and it's spaced 640?
Well, if it's space 640, you wouldn't be able to drill another well within that same 640, right?
Well, if it's plugged, you can. So remember, if you plug a well, then that opens up that lease, and it's orphaned, so it's not really producing anyway. It's just leaking.
Right. Well, so I guess I'm thinking as I talk, and I'm thinking that might be a good point. And if there's no other producing well in that 640 unit, you could put a producing well in that 640 unit However, it doesn't make real sense to do that, because why would you plug a well if there's remaining potential within that 640 unit in that reservoir?
Well, I won't go into a lot of detail, but sometimes at least on gas units, yeah, there's maybe not a lot of drive, but that well was poorly, it was an old well, it's been all messed up, they didn't maintain it. And I think over on a different part of the 640, and I'm a mineral owner, I'm not leasing it or anything, I'm the owner. But so somebody comes in, they go, I think that, that there's actually some potential over for some better drive over on the other side, or we may even want to do water flood. I doubt that would happen in a gas well, but I'm just saying that. But at any rate, what I'm saying is that when to get the carbon credits, they said, okay, this is going to be permanent, and so then I didn't have it. Have they suddenly made that entire unit off limits for production in the future?
Yeah, so I think one really important point here is that the carbon credit isn't associated with recoverable reserves in the ground. The carbon credit is associated with leaking hydrocarbons, leaking methane.
Okay,
and
so okay, good.
Yeah, so it's sort of two different topics.
Mhm.
And so you could plug an orphan well that is leaking, even though it is within a spacing unit where there's another well that's producing next door, and that producing well isn't leaking because it's producing, right, in theory, but you're still stopping a leak. And so I think it's this difference, and there have been quite a few discussions in the last couple of years about addressing sort of technically recoverable reserves left in place.
Right. Yeah.
And that's not what this is doing. This is doing just simply leaks. And I think there's some question as to whether or not that reserves left in place substantiates a carbon credit. Maybe it's a good thing to do depending upon the way you think about it, but is it a carbon credit? Because there's all kinds of really cool ways to mitigate climate change, but a carbon credit has a very specific definition, and I'm not sure that it meets that definition. So maybe a separate topic altogether. And I think, again, something a lot of people are talking about right now is whether or not a methodology like that could be put into place sometime into the future.
Okay, great. So that's good. So in other words, apple and oranges, this is the methodology for orphan wells, which is not the same as the methodology for plugging marginal wells and leaving the surface room.
Right, orphan wells and leaks. Not even, some orphan wells may have recoverable reserves in place as well, and that's not necessarily what we're addressing here.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You cannot change physics. I'm Daniel Schwartz. I'm reading your chat question here, and I agree, you cannot change physics, but we do have to measure physics in human time, not geologic time. And so I think the question is that going to happen within the realm of millennia, or is it going to happen within the realm of 1,000 years? And so really those pressure differentials, if we kind of lean on the drilling and spacing units and increased density and different different distances from lines that are established when we put those rules for drilling in place, those are done kind of understanding the breakover point where that pressure differential is so low that it isn't going to create that leakage over the course of the time frame that we're talking about. And so on the one hand, I of course agree with you that physics is physics and that may happen, but we have to address what we can address here. And I think time is really an important component when you think about kind of the answer to that question. So Maris, I don't know if you have anything else.
You nailed it. And just that, we're really trying to get to these short-lived climate pollutants in the nearest term possible. And so we're not, and I'm a geologist and I like thinking about geologic time, but I don't get paid for that right now.
Maris, just to add, a couple of people have asked a similar question as at the beginning about whether or not the methodology will be expanded beyond the USA and Canada. Do you envision that, or?
I do, and I've gotten some requests to do that, even another one last week, and certainly something that we're looking at doing. We're familiar. I worked oil and gas in the U.S. and so familiar with the rules and regs around this country. Became more familiar with Canada. It would be an update of the methodology that would require going through the public comment and peer review again to add additional eligibility for that. But if folks have countries or jurisdictions that they have in mind, we're increasingly looking at international opportunities. What we do look for is that there is a regulatory body in place with appropriate enforcement that will make sure that the wells are being plugged appropriately. There's rules on how to plug, and someone's actually out there making sure that you're pouring the right amount of cement, that kind of thing.
Thank you very much.
I'm trying to type as quick as I can to some of these answers in the chat. So I'm trying to get to people.
It's pretty amazing how much interest there is, and I think that the issues and the possibilities are just growing all the time, and the opportunities and understanding the methodologies is incredibly important.
And as far as the market goes, if any of you have any question, I mean, you have my email there. I think Susan, you might mention there's another conference that you're working on that has got one of these topics as well. So I don't know if this one specifically will come up there, but might be something that you could mention to people.
Yes, definitely. So we will be having a conference in Pittsburgh, February 27th and 28th. It'll be face-to-face, and we will be dedicating basically a day to talk about carbon credits. And we'll also actually talk about the marginal well types too. So just to talk about where it is, and we'll also talk about the validation and the exchange, which I think is quite interesting as well. As I understand it, in Canada, carbon credits are considered a commodity, no, a security, and here they're considered a commodity. Is that correct?
Well, there's ongoing definitions, right? We're actually in a regulatory process in Canada, so I think internationally there's a lot of work going on as well, to define them. We're fully regulated out of under the Abu Dhabi Global Market, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority, and there we're defined as a commodity. They have chosen to define carbon credits as a commodity. Most jurisdictions have, some have defined it as a security. So really just it clicks sort of indicates who will be, if you're going into a regulated market, who you'll be regulated by and under what conditions. So, and how you can transact, if you can transact in the swap market or the futures market or what have you. So,
and the advantages of going with AirCarbon, in my opinion, is that you actually reach out to the big customers who want high quality, and also they want to kind of have the assurance that these have been vetted.
I think it's the transparency and it's the efficiency, it's the low cost. All of our fees are established, but we also have all these accounts and linkages with the registries as well. We do a lot of work with ACR, and nothing but cooperation. It's very, very, it's a very interesting experience. I manage our relationship with ACR, and I can tell you it's been nothing but positive. So really happy with this methodology being an ACR methodology, and then the work that others, Rebellion and others, have done here. So it takes really good product developers and people with foresight to take a chance to develop excellent projects at the beginning, so that, what Staci and her company are doing, it's going to give, it's going to provide the baseline for good projects. I think personally, as this goes forward, I guess we'll wait till we see what, the issuance, but, I think knowing what I've seen, it's, taking this very seriously and doing what Staci and her team are doing is what's going to make this a good application. And the methodology will grow in importance, I believe, over time as a result of good project developers.
I think that the big breakthrough will be when it's good for compliance markets as well as voluntary.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah, Corinne can talk about this too. We're seeing more, convergence isn't quite the word, but moving in parallel, and certainly with Corsia and the ICBCM and just having more established rules and standards around the voluntary market is only going to be painful in the near term, but benefit us all in the medium to long term.
Well, I just want to give a big plug again to our AAPG's Division of Environmental Geosciences and also Division of Professional Affairs, also Tulsa Geological Society. And I think, I don't know, Staci, if you're in Tulsa now, but the rebellion has been in Tulsa. And the projects are near Tulsa in Washington County, which is super exciting. And just, it's just really nice. Well,
Yes.
Well, I want to thank Corinne Boone and Staci Taruscio and Maris Densmore once again for being here. It's great to be able to have leaders in the industry and hear directly from you. Just to recap that we've recorded a recording, and we will be posting recording. I'll send a link in our follow-up email. Also, I'll go ahead and attach the I'll probably send two, because sometimes people can't get emails if there's an attachment. So I'll send the PowerPoint as well. So thank you again, and thanks for the audience members, and can't wait till the next time.
Thank you all.
Thanks everybody. Great questions.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.